Yeah, time starts here. I was confused for a sec, thinking, well, hi, anyway, Jadinia, I'm sorry, the power went out, and so I could not put the live in at the time. So, yeah, I'm back now, and let's hope it stays on. I mean, it's been on, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the power now, so. Anyhow, I wanted to basically talk about gender construct and things having to do with transgender people, transgenderism, because in my other video, someone brought up um, the idea of gender and how, people see it differently. For me, I think a major thing is I don't really talk about this too much about myself. I really don't get into um, different factors I feel between my well, anyway, I kind of feel like, with gender and transgenderism, that often people think that gender and sex are connected to each other. And I mean, to the large majority, yes, it is. You know, there's a lot of men who are of the male sex, and they fit into the social construct of the gender that is basically expressed and expected of them to basically have, and to me, I just feel like with transgender people, a lot of the time, well, I've been looking up different things, for example, and there are different correlations to gender and your sex, different behaviors and your sex. And, from my perspective, it's always like, well, behavior is just behavior, right? To me, that's how I've always seen it. Behavior is just behavior. I've never really felt gender was real. And I've said that before. I think I've said that in two videos that I made. That I just feel like, gender is just basically, a construct by society. And the reason I feel that way is because, well, it changes from one community to another community. So there are men in some communities that wear dresses, for example, and there are men who do not wear dresses in other communities. If gender was such an innate thing, then men would innately know not to wear dresses, or men would know innately that they need to wear dresses. But I mean, obviously, it does not correlate to a man's sex, whether he wears a dress or not. It doesn't even correlate to his gender. It only correlates to what's acceptable for his gender. And so for me, it's like, because of the fact that it's always ever changing, no matter what culture it is, then for me, it's always like, I don't understand basically how it can still be a reality for people as far as their sex. You get what I'm saying? Like, how can it be actually real if it's always changing? If the rules are always changing, then the game isn't really a game because it's not it's not always the same depending on what culture and what country we're in. People don't change genders, well, they don't change sexes at least when they go to different countries. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't really change. And so that's why I'm like, if your gender expectation and expression changes country to country, then how real is gender? That's why to me, I don't mind and I don't care if I call someone a man or a woman. I don't care if I call them a he or a she. I don't care if they wear a dress or pants because in reality, they could be doing all these things and be either gender. So, I mean, it would just matter what culture they're from. So to me, it's just like I don't see. That's why I can't really understand how we're supposed to pretend it really exists, you know? And so I extrapolate that to further things. Um, it goes down a lot to how I was raised, for example. And I've said this before, to me, when people when they are born and they have a family and they have a father and a mother and they are taught basically the norms of what the man does and the norms of what the woman does and what the norms of a boy and a girl and how they're supposed to grow into those prospective genders. It's like from my perspective, I do not I was not really raised with that basically because I didn't like my father. I've always said this. My father died before I was born. So I never saw the male role specifically or the female role really. And that honestly goes back down to genetics, honestly, because that's the thing. People always talk about, gender is innate, right? And it usually coincides with your sex. But there's more to that because people always say that your sex is female or male, but there's things like, as far as like scientifically, hormonally, there's been plenty of studies shown that, the more testosterone you have can actually be shown in other features than just your genitals, for example. And the more estrogen you have can show that as well. So, for example, some people have actually done studies showing how if you have a more prominent, like females, for example, on average, have more prominent pointer fingers because they have more exposure to estrogen in vitro. While men have more longer ringer fingers. Sorry about that, but ring fingers basically, um, because they have more exposure to testosterone in vitro. It's called the digit ratio theory, basically, and you can see that that is not always the case. It's most of the time the case that females have longer pointer fingers, basically, but not always the case. Some people are actually exposed to more testosterone and are female born, like they have female genitals. And some people are born male and they have more exposure to estrogen. When these things happen, they show that when men, for example, have longer pointer fingers, or if women have longer ring fingers, different behavior is expressed differently than their perspective sexes, basically. So it's different than their actual than the people of their sex that actually have longer pointer fingers or ring fingers. You get what I'm saying? So long story short, basically, for me, my mother, for example, was more of a, I guess, she's not masculine, but she has certain characteristics that are masculine. She might be more, I guess, mentally masculine, I guess you could say. And for me, growing up, like I said, I didn't grow up with really the role of a woman or the role of a man, really, because my mother was more so, she didn't fall into either of those categories, basically. So for me, it's always been kind of like I've always noticed I'm very similar to that, basically, where I'm more on the masculine end of things. And like I said, both of us do have the more prominent ring finger, which means basically more exposure to testosterone. But anyway, um, so I guess that's why my perspective of gender has always been where, like, to me, it's like, yes, the majority of female born people or male born people might fall into the expected gender expression and gender roles that are expected of men and women. But many people may not fall into that category they because they have a different, genetic makeup, basically, or whatever, and so therefore they may not fall into the same category as those people. Does that mean that those people are no longer men or women? I've never felt like it really matters, because if you really think of it, like I said, going back to what I was saying about how culture changes gender, no matter, like, depending on what country we're from, then it's kind of like how important is it, and how much is it really real when there are plenty of people who may not even fall into that category in the first place in that culture? Like I said, there are many people who are not as will not fit cookie cutter, basically, into the expected gender, expression or roles that are expected of them. So that's why I feel like gender is basically not really real, because, like, if it keeps changing, and even in a community where it is the same, the people within that community don't all fall into those expected gender roles, then how real is it, and why is it needed? You know what I mean? Like, I understand I feel like it's a process and a system that works for certain people. And for the people it works for, that's great. But for the people it doesn't work for, why would we use such a system when it doesn't apply to us? And it doesn't really, it causes more harm than good to me, because it's not really gonna do us any good service, basically. Um, I sometimes wonder, though, like, personally, because growing up, for me, I always wondered if gender, roles being split up affects people like myself differently, possibly. Because when I was younger, I was like, maybe like, I wasn't very young. I was like 2 or 3. I was like tween, I guess. Yeah, I was about 10, probably 12, somewhere around there. And wonder basically if possibly when I was like 10, 12, I would see people that I interacted with, like friends and family and things of that nature, who would basically have that concept of, the mother and the father and the more gender role structures basically going on in their families more so. And the way the daughter would relate to the father would always be a bit of a struggle for me, more of a problem for me. You know, Whenever I really thought of my parents, I never really related to my parents as if they were not in a way basically that I basically felt like the whole father daughter relationship was always weird to me. And I think honestly that was really helpful for me in a sense because people always acted like, a daughter needs their father, they need that father daughter relationship. Me, I never really searched for that because I always felt like that kind of situation made me feel very uncomfortable. And seeing it even made me very uncomfortable thinking of if it weirded me out. Like basically, a son relates to their father differently than their a daughter does. So I think that was my problem, basically. Um, but I never really had to worry about that too much in my household because I didn't have to interact with my father because he was dead. So it was kind of like, I never really had to be conscious really of my difference until I was a little older, which helped me um because like I said, it made me kind of have a unisex idea of gender basically. Because like I said, if I was to think of gender in that way, it would be a bit more triggering for me in the sense of knowing, that you do not align really well, basically, with your expected gender, basically. Which, I don't know, like, you would think growing up with my mother, I would have that. But I guess because my mother is the same thing as me, I never had that problem. With that said, it didn't stop me, obviously, from having my issues with the whole sex side of it. I mean, I still have my dysphoria, but the part about gender, I think for me, it's always been easier just to think of gender as not existing, really. And I think that's because if I did think of gender existing, then I would obviously align more with the male gender. And then obviously it would be a mismatch and I would feel more problems than I actually do now. So to me, it's just like, you know, I don't know. Like, I think that's to explain to the person who was asking why I didn't see gender as existing is because, I don't feel I guess I fit well between male and female gender wise. And so to me, it doesn't really make much sense to me, especially since I didn't have to grow up with it. So why would I include something that I don't really fit into in the first place that I didn't have to really acknowledge in the first place? You get what I'm saying? I hope that makes sense. Um, but yeah, it's just like the gender side of it is like the reality of it really isn't the reality for me. Therefore, I guess I just don't acknowledge it existing altogether. But if you think of it, many of the time, people who do fit into the system of the gender roles, many of them actually do, try to ignore the people who don't fit in, basically. So, I mean, personally, it's just like, then why would someone acknowledge someone that's different than them, that doesn't acknowledge them? You know what I mean? It's kind of like a tat for tat thing. But yeah, anyhow, for me, reality is just, that I was born female. So that's what I go off of rather than gender roles specifically. I mean, like, if it's not tangible, if it's not real, then why do I have to acknowledge it? I have to acknowledge that I'm a female. I have to acknowledge that I have the physical body of a woman. So, I mean, like, at that point, I don't understand why I would acknowledge gender if, you know, it, I can't see it. I don't really need to see it. It's not really beneficial to me. So, I mean, like, that's why I'm more, I guess, all in all, generally, when it comes to gender, I'm like non binary or not like more agender or something of that nature. But yeah, I just don't really acknowledge it too much. So, whatever you want to label me, whatever. But yeah. So that's all I have to say on that. And I'm gonna do another video. I just was doing this video because someone asked about my perception on gender. So there you go. Hope that made some sense.